focus on solutions, not problems. Human cognition naturally gravitates toward identifying problems. From an evolutionary perspective, the human brain developed mechanisms that prioritized the detection of threats and obstacles. Early humans survived by recognizing dangers quickly, analyzing them, and attempting to avoid them. This biological tendency still exists today, even though modern life requires a different type of thinking. The same mechanism that once protected humans from predators now often traps people in cycles of excessive problem analysis. Instead of enabling action, this tendency can lead to overthinking, hesitation, and mental fatigue. When individuals encounter a difficulty, their initial reaction is usually to evaluate the nature of the problem. This evaluation process is useful to a certain extent. However, many people continue analyzing the difficulty long after they have gathered enough information to act. They repeatedly revisit the same question, why the problem exists. They examine causes, assign blame, and mentally replay the circumstances that produce the challenge. While some level of reflection is necessary, prolonged focus on the problem itself rarely produces progress. It only reinforces a sense of limitation. A practical distinction must therefore be made between understanding a problem and dwelling on it. Understanding involves gathering the essential information required to define the issue accurately. Dwelling involves repeatedly revisiting the same information without generating new insights or actions. The first process is constructive, while the second is largely unproductive. Yet many individuals confuse the two, believing that continued discussion or reflection will eventually reveal a solution. In reality, once the fundamental structure of a problem has been identified, further attention must shift toward possible responses. In professional environments, this distinction is particularly important. Organizations that dedicate excessive time to discussing problems often experience slow progress. Meetings become dominated by descriptions of difficulties rather than proposals for improvement. Participants may present detailed explanations of what went wrong, who was responsible, or why circumstances were unfavorable. Although such analysis may appear thorough, it often delays the development of corrective strategies. Effective organizations recognize that, after a problem has been defined, attention must move quickly toward alternative courses of action. The same principle applies at the individual level. When a person repeatedly concentrates on obstacles, the mind tends to magnify them. Psychological research suggests that attention acts as an amplifier of perceived importance. The more attention a subject receives, the more significant it appears. As a result, persistent focus on problems can create the impression that they are larger and more complex than they actually are. This perception can reduce confidence and discourage experimentation, both of which are essential for solving challenges. Solution-oriented thinking functions differently. Instead of asking why a problem exists indefinitely, it directs cognitive resources toward identifying possible adjustments, alternatives, or improvements. This shift does not deny the existence of difficulties. Rather, it recognizes that understanding alone is insufficient. Progress requires constructing pathways forward. In many cases, the exact cause of a problem may never be fully known. Waiting for complete certainty before acting can therefore prevent any action at all. Logical problem-solving usually follows a structured process. First, the issue is defined clearly and concisely. Second, the relevant constraints and objectives are identified. Third, multiple potential responses are generated. Fourth, the most feasible option is implemented and evaluated. The crucial point is that the majority of this process involves generating and testing solutions rather than repeatedly revisiting the original difficulty. By dedicating greater cognitive effort to potential responses, individuals increase the probability of discovering workable strategies. Another reason why solution-focused thinking is effective lies in the way human attention influences creativity. When the brain attempts to design solutions, it begins searching for patterns, connections, and possibilities. This activates cognitive processes related to innovation and problem resolution. Conversely, when attention remains fixed on the limitations of a situation, these creative mechanisms are less likely to engage. The mind essentially receives a signal that the situation is static rather than changeable. It is important to clarify that focusing on solutions does not imply ignoring risks or complexities. In many fields, such as engineering, medicine, and scientific research, careful problem analysis is essential. However, professionals in these areas do not remain permanently in diagnostic mode. Once sufficient information has been gathered, they transition toward experimentation and intervention. This balance between analysis and action represents the core of effective problem management. Individuals who consistently emphasize solutions tend to develop greater adaptability. Instead of perceiving obstacles as permanent barriers, they interpret them as temporary conditions that require adjustment. This interpretation changes behavior. Rather than investing energy in frustration or complaint, attention is directed toward identifying what can be modified, improved, or redesigned. Over time, this habit creates a more resilient and efficient approach to challenges. The process of shifting attention from problems to solutions requires deliberate practice. Because the human brain is naturally inclined to analyze threats, many people must consciously interrupt cycles of repetitive problem thinking. One effective technique involves asking a structured question whenever a difficulty appears. What specific action could improve this situation, even slightly? This question redirects cognitive effort toward constructive exploration. Even small adjustments can initiate progress, and progress often reveals additional possibilities that were not visible during the initial stage of analysis. Another useful approach is to separate description from action. A brief description defines the issue. Action identifies the next step. When individuals or organizations spend disproportionate time describing difficulties without specifying actions, stagnation occurs. When description is followed immediately by experimentation, improvement becomes more likely. Over time, repeated emphasis on solutions gradually reshapes cognitive habits. The mind becomes more efficient at identifying opportunities for change rather than cataloging limitations. This transformation does not eliminate problems from life, but it significantly improves the ability to respond to them. The result is a mindset that treats challenges not as permanent obstacles, but as situations requiring thoughtful adjustment. A critical barrier that prevents people from moving toward solutions is the psychological tendency to personalize difficulties. When a problem occurs, individuals often interpret it as a reflection of their competence, identity, or worth. This interpretation introduces emotional reactions such as embarrassment, frustration, or defensiveness. Once emotions dominate the cognitive process, the brain's capacity for structured reasoning becomes less efficient. Instead of examining possible adjustments, the individual begins protecting their self-image. The focus shifts from resolving the issue to justifying why it occurred. This reaction can be observed in many professional environments. When a project fails or a mistake occurs, discussions frequently revolve around identifying responsibility rather than identifying corrective measures. While accountability is important, excessive attention to blame rarely improves outcomes. It simply consumes time and reinforces defensive behavior among participants. People become reluctant to acknowledge mistakes because they anticipate criticism rather than constructive dialogue. As a result, valuable information that could guide solutions remains unspoken. A solution-oriented approach treats problems as neutral events rather than personal failures. In this perspective, A difficulty is simply a discrepancy between the current state and the desired state. The task is therefore not to defend the past, but to adjust the future. This shift removes unnecessary emotional weight from the situation and allows participants to concentrate on practical responses. When problems are depersonalized in this way, collaboration becomes easier because individuals feel safer proposing ideas and experimenting with alternatives. Another factor that encourages excessive focus on problems is the illusion that detailed understanding automatically produces solutions. Many individuals believe that if they analyze a situation deeply enough, a clear answer will eventually emerge without deliberate experimentation. While understanding is valuable, complex systems rarely reveal solutions through analysis alone. In many fields, progress occurs through cycles of trial, feedback, and adjustment rather than through perfect theoretical insight. Scientific research provides a clear example of this principle. Researchers begin by identifying a question or challenge, but the majority of their work involves designing experiments to test possible explanations. Each experiment generates new information that either supports or contradicts the initial assumption. Through repeated cycles of testing and refinement, a workable solution gradually emerges. Importantly, scientists do not wait for complete certainty before taking action. They construct hypotheses and evaluate them through practical investigation. This same method can be applied to everyday challenges. Instead of attempting to mentally predict the perfect answer, individuals can treat potential solutions as small experiments. Each action provides feedback that clarifies what works and what does not. This process reduces the psychological pressure associated with making decisions because the goal is not immediate perfection but progressive improvement. An additional reason people remain focused on problems is the human preference for certainty. Problems create uncertainty, and uncertainty can produce discomfort. As a result, individuals may attempt to reduce this discomfort by gathering more and more information about the difficulty. They review details repeatedly in an attempt to achieve complete understanding before acting. Unfortunately, many real-world situations contain variables that cannot be fully known. Waiting for perfect information therefore leads to prolonged inactivity. Solution-focused thinking accepts that uncertainty is unavoidable. Instead of attempting to eliminate it completely, the individual proceeds with partial information while remaining prepared to adjust the strategy later. This flexible approach increases speed and adaptability. By contrast, those who wait for absolute certainty often miss opportunities because conditions change before they act. Cognitive psychology also suggests that attention influences emotional state. When individuals continuously review problems, they reinforce negative emotions associated with those situations. These emotions can reduce motivation and increase the perception of difficulty. Conversely, when attention is directed toward constructing solutions, the mind begins to experience a sense of progress and agency. Even small steps forward can improve confidence because they demonstrate that change is possible. Importantly, solution-oriented thinking does not require immediate success. Many effective strategies emerge only after several unsuccessful attempts. The key difference lies in how failure is interpreted. In a problem-focused mindset, failure is often perceived as confirmation that the situation is unsolvable or that personal ability is insufficient. In a solution-focused mindset, failure is treated as information that guides the next attempt. Each unsuccessful approach eliminates one possibility and clarifies which alternatives may be more effective. This distinction is visible in fields such as engineering and technology development. Complex systems are rarely perfected on the first attempt. Instead, engineers build prototypes, test them, observe weaknesses, and modify the design accordingly. The process is iterative. Each version of the design improves upon the previous one. Progress occurs not because engineers avoid problems, but because they treat each problem as a source of data for improvement. In daily life, adopting this iterative perspective can transform the way individuals approach challenges. A problem becomes less intimidating when it is viewed as part of an ongoing adjustment process, rather than as a final judgment on one's ability. The objective shifts from avoiding mistakes to learning from them as efficiently as possible. Another practical strategy involves narrowing the scope of attention. Large problems often appear overwhelming because they contain many interconnected elements. When individuals attempt to solve the entire issue simultaneously, the complexity may discourage action. Breaking the problem into smaller components allows attention to focus on manageable tasks. Each resolved component reduces the overall difficulty and gradually moves the situation toward improvement. For example, an organization experiencing declining productivity might initially perceive the issue as broad and complicated. However, careful examination may reveal specific contributing factors such as inefficient communication, unclear responsibilities, or outdated procedures. Addressing each factor individually is far more practical than attempting to resolve the entire problem through a single large intervention. This method also improves motivation. When progress can be measured through small completed steps, individuals experience a sense of accomplishment that encourages continued effort. Large, undefined problems rarely provide this feedback, which can make sustained engagement more difficult. It is also useful to recognize that many perceived problems originate from rigid assumptions about how situations should develop. When expectations are inflexible, any deviation appears as a serious obstacle. However, when expectations are treated as adjustable guidelines rather than fixed requirements, the same situation may reveal alternative opportunities. Flexibility, therefore, expands the range of possible solutions. In practical terms, this means questioning initial assumptions whenever a difficulty arises. Instead of assuming that a particular path must succeed, the individual considers whether different approaches might achieve the same objective more effectively. This openness often reveals options that were previously overlooked because attention was restricted to preserving the original plan. The development of a solution-focused mindset ultimately depends on repeated behavioral patterns. Each time an individual consciously redirects attention from describing a problem to designing a response, the brain strengthens neural pathways associated with constructive thinking. Over time, this redirection becomes more automatic. The individual begins to approach challenges with curiosity rather than frustration, and the search for practical responses becomes a habitual part of decision-making. Through this gradual process, the emphasis on solutions becomes integrated into everyday thinking. Problems still occur, but they no longer dominate attention. Instead, they serve as starting points for analysis, experimentation, and improvement. The individual moves steadily from reaction toward deliberate problem management, creating a more productive and adaptable approach to complex situations. Another important aspect of solution-focused thinking involves the way individuals define the structure of a problem. Many difficulties persist not because they are inherently complex, but because they are framed in vague or abstract terms. When a problem is defined broadly, such as "nothing is working" or "the situation is impossible," the mind has little guidance for generating practical responses. Effective problem resolution requires transforming general dissatisfaction into a clearly defined question. The more precisely the issue is described, the easier it becomes to design an appropriate response. For example, a person who believes that a project has failed may initially describe the situation in very general language. However, a closer examination might reveal that the difficulty originates from a specific stage of the process, such as insufficient planning, unclear communication, or unrealistic deadlines. Once the difficulty is defined at this level of precision, the range of possible responses becomes clearer. The problem is no longer an undefined failure, but a specific operational weakness that can be corrected. This principle is widely used in technical disciplines. Engineers, analysts, and researchers rarely begin with vague descriptions of failure. Instead, they attempt to isolate measurable variables that contribute to the issue. By identifying the exact point where a system deviates from the expected outcome, they convert a complex situation into a manageable technical question. This approach allows them to test targeted adjustments rather than attempting broad, unfocused changes. Another barrier to solution development is the tendency to confuse correlation with causation. When individuals observe a problem repeatedly, they may assume that the most visible factor is the direct cause. However, many situations involve multiple interacting variables. Acting on incorrect assumptions can therefore produce ineffective solutions. A careful examination of the relationships between variables is necessary before implementing major changes. In practical terms, this means asking structured questions about the sequence of events that produced the difficulty. What conditions were present before the problem appeared? What factors changed shortly before the outcome occurred? Which elements remained constant throughout the process? By examining these questions systematically, individuals can identify patterns that reveal the true source of the issue. Once the underlying cause is identified accurately, solutions become far more effective. An additional factor that influences the ability to focus on solutions is cognitive overload. When individuals attempt to process too many variables simultaneously, the brain's decision-making capacity becomes less efficient. The result is often confusion rather than clarity. Complex problems, therefore, benefit from structured methods that organize information in manageable segments. Tools such as written analysis, diagrams, or step-by-step evaluation allow the mind to externalize information instead of holding every detail in memory at once. Writing, in particular, can significantly improve problem resolution. When ideas remain only in the mind, they are difficult to evaluate objectively. Thoughts may shift rapidly, and important details may be forgotten. Placing the relevant information on paper or in a structured document allows the individual to examine the problem from a more analytical perspective. Patterns, inconsistencies, and opportunities often become visible only after the information has been organized externally. Another characteristic of effective solution-focused thinking is the willingness to generate multiple alternatives before selecting a final course of action. People who concentrate exclusively on a single potential solution may become discouraged if that approach fails. By contrast, those who develop several possible responses maintain greater flexibility. If one strategy proves ineffective, another option can be implemented without restarting the entire decision process. This practice is particularly useful in situations where uncertainty is high. When outcomes cannot be predicted with complete accuracy, having multiple strategies available reduces risk. Decision-makers can evaluate the advantages and disadvantages of each alternative and choose the one that offers the most balanced outcome given the available information. The evaluation of solutions also requires attention to practical constraints. A theoretically ideal solution may be impossible to implement due to limitations such as time, resources, or institutional restrictions. Effective problem-solving therefore balances creativity with realism. The objective is not to design a perfect response, but to identify the most practical improvement under existing conditions. This pragmatic approach explains why many successful solutions appear simple when viewed after the fact. Often, the most effective response involves adjusting one key variable rather than redesigning the entire system. However, identifying that variable requires careful analysis and experimentation. Once the correct leverage point is discovered, relatively small changes can produce significant improvements. Feedback plays a crucial role in this process. After implementing a solution, individuals must observe the results carefully to determine whether the adjustment produced the expected outcome. If the change improves the situation, it can be reinforced or expanded. If the change produces no improvement, the information gained still contributes to understanding the system more clearly. Each attempt generates data that guides the next step. This feedback cycle gradually refines both the understanding of the problem and the effectiveness of the solutions. Over time, the process becomes more efficient because individuals learn which approaches tend to produce useful results. Experience, therefore, becomes an important resource in developing solution-focused thinking. Repeated exposure to challenges strengthens the ability to recognize patterns and anticipate potential outcomes. Another significant factor is the role of perspective. When individuals remain deeply involved in a particular situation, they may overlook possibilities that are obvious to an outside observer. This occurs because familiarity can limit perception. The mind becomes accustomed to viewing the situation through a particular framework and may fail to question underlying assumptions. Seeking alternative perspectives can therefore accelerate the development of solutions. Consulting colleagues, mentors, or experts introduces new viewpoints that may reveal options previously overlooked. Even when the final decision remains unchanged, the process of discussing the issue with others can clarify the reasoning behind it and highlight potential weaknesses in the plan. It is also useful to consider the long-term consequences of different solutions. Some responses may resolve the immediate difficulty, but create additional complications later. Others may require greater effort initially, but produce more stable outcomes over time. Evaluating both immediate and long-term effects allows individuals to choose solutions that align with broader objectives rather than temporary convenience. This broader perspective reinforces the idea that problem-solving is not merely a reaction to difficulty, but an integral component of effective decision-making. Every complex system encounters obstacles, adjustments, and unexpected outcomes. The ability to respond constructively to these conditions determines whether the system deteriorates or improves over time. Ultimately, focusing on solutions requires a disciplined allocation of attention. Problems must be acknowledged and defined accurately, but they should not dominate the thinking process indefinitely. Once sufficient understanding has been achieved, attention must shift toward designing responses, testing alternatives, and refining strategies through feedback. This continuous movement between analysis and action forms the foundation of productive problem management. When individuals develop this habit consistently, challenges become less intimidating. Difficulties are interpreted as signals that adjustment is required rather than as evidence of failure. This interpretation encourages curiosity, experimentation, and learning. Over time, the emphasis on solutions transforms not only the way problems are handled, but also the way opportunities are recognized and pursued. Another dimension of effective solution-oriented thinking involves the management of attention over time. Human attention is limited, and the way it is distributed significantly influences the quality of decisions. When attention remains fixed on negative outcomes, the mind tends to construct narratives that reinforce pessimistic expectations. These narratives often exaggerate the permanence or severity of a problem. In contrast, when attention is directed toward identifying possible adjustments, the cognitive system begins searching for patterns that indicate improvement or opportunity. This difference in focus does not change the objective facts of a situation, but it strongly influences how those facts are interpreted and what actions follow. One practical consequence of this principle is that the framing of a question can determine the direction of thought. A question such as, "Why does this keep failing?" encourages the mind to revisit past difficulties. While such reflection may reveal useful information, it rarely generates forward movement if repeated excessively. A question such as, "What condition would allow this to work better?" encourages the mind to imagine potential improvements. The shift may appear subtle, yet it redirects the brain's problem-solving mechanisms toward designing alternatives rather than analyzing frustrations. This method is widely used in structured problem-solving frameworks. Many analytical models begin with a clear definition of the current situation, but quickly transition to exploring the desired outcome. Once the desired state is identified, the task becomes identifying the steps necessary to move from the current state to that future condition. By focusing on the transition between these 2 points, the process naturally emphasizes solutions rather than complaints. Another factor that influences solution development is the distinction between controllable and uncontrollable variables. Many problems contain elements that lie beyond the influence of the individual or organization attempting to solve them. External economic conditions, natural events, or regulatory constraints may limit the range of possible actions. When individuals concentrate heavily on these uncontrollable factors, frustration often increases because no practical response can alter them directly. Effective problem solvers, therefore, allocate attention primarily to variables that can actually be modified. This principle can be illustrated through a simple example. A business may experience reduced sales due to a general economic downturn. The broader economic condition is largely outside the company's control. However, other factors, such as marketing strategy, product design, pricing structure, or customer communication, remain adjustable. By focusing on these controllable variables, the organization can still improve its position despite unfavorable external conditions. The problem is not ignored, but attention is directed toward areas where action is possible. In many situations, the perception of limited control is itself inaccurate. Individuals sometimes assume that a condition cannot be changed simply because they have not yet identified a feasible method. This assumption can prevent exploration of alternative strategies. A solution-focused mindset treats such assumptions as hypotheses rather than facts. Instead of concluding that change is impossible, the individual asks whether the limitation is truly absolute or whether it simply reflects current knowledge. This questioning often reveals opportunities that were previously overlooked. Another common obstacle to effective problem-solving is the desire for immediate resolution. Many difficulties involve systems that evolve over time, and therefore their solutions also require time to produce measurable results. When individuals expect instant improvement, they may abandon promising strategies prematurely. A more analytical approach recognizes that certain adjustments must be maintained long enough to evaluate their true effect. Patience becomes an essential component of rational decision-making. The process of evaluating solutions also requires objective measurement. Without measurable indicators of progress, it is difficult to determine whether an intervention has improved the situation. Clear metrics allow individuals to track changes and compare the effectiveness of different approaches. For example, a team attempting to improve productivity might measure output, error rates, or time required to complete tasks. By observing how these metrics respond to specific changes, the team can identify which adjustments produce meaningful improvement. Measurement also helps reduce the influence of subjective bias. People often interpret outcomes in ways that confirm their prior beliefs. If a solution aligns with expectations, individuals may perceive it as successful even when the improvement is minimal. Conversely, a strategy that contradicts initial assumptions may be dismissed despite producing useful results. Quantitative evaluation provides a more reliable basis for judging effectiveness because it relies on observable data rather than personal preference. Another significant element in solution-focused thinking is the ability to simplify complex systems. Many problems appear overwhelming because they involve numerous interacting components. However, within most systems, there are certain variables that exert disproportionate influence over outcomes. Identifying these leverage points can dramatically increase the efficiency of problem resolution. Instead of attempting to modify every element simultaneously, attention is directed toward the factors that generate the greatest impact. For instance, in organizational management, communication structures often function as a leverage point. Miscommunication can produce delays, errors, and conflict across multiple departments. Improving the clarity and efficiency of communication may therefore resolve several secondary problems simultaneously. By contrast, addressing each individual symptom without examining the underlying communication structure would require far greater effort. Experience gradually improves the ability to identify such leverage points. Individuals who have repeatedly analyzed complex situations begin to recognize patterns that reveal where interventions are most likely to succeed. This pattern recognition reduces the time required to move from problem identification to solution testing. In this sense, expertise is not merely the accumulation of knowledge, but also the refinement of attention toward the most influential variables. Another important component of constructive problem management is maintaining intellectual flexibility. Situations often change after a solution has been implemented. New information may appear, external conditions may shift, or unexpected consequences may emerge. When individuals become rigidly attached to a particular strategy, they may ignore signals indicating that modification is necessary. Flexibility allows the decision-maker to treat each solution as provisional rather than final. This adaptability does not imply inconsistency or indecision. Instead, it reflects an understanding that complex systems evolve over time. Effective strategies must therefore evolve as well. By continuously observing outcomes and adjusting responses accordingly, individuals maintain alignment between their actions and the realities of the environment. Collaboration also plays a significant role in expanding the range of available solutions. Different individuals possess different experiences, knowledge, and analytical styles. When these perspectives are combined, the probability of discovering effective strategies increases. Collective problem-solving allows participants to challenge assumptions, refine ideas, and test proposals more thoroughly than any single individual could accomplish alone. However, collaboration is productive only when the discussion remains focused on constructive possibilities rather than prolonged complaint. Teams that spend most of their time describing obstacles often experience declining morale and reduced creativity. By contrast, teams that treat problems as shared analytical challenges tend to generate a greater number of useful ideas. The tone of the conversation, therefore, influences not only motivation, but also the quality of the solutions produced. In the long term, the habit of emphasizing solutions gradually reshapes an individual's perception of challenges. Situations that once appeared overwhelming become structured problems that can be examined systematically. The emotional reaction to difficulty becomes less intense because the mind immediately begins considering possible responses. This shift does not eliminate uncertainty, but it transforms uncertainty into an environment for exploration rather than a source of paralysis. As this habit strengthens, the individual begins to recognize that many problems contain valuable information. Difficulties reveal weaknesses in existing systems, assumptions, or methods. When these weaknesses are identified and corrected, the system becomes stronger than it was before the problem occurred. In this way, challenges contribute to progress by exposing areas that require improvement. This perspective ultimately reinforces the central principle of solution-focused thinking. Problems are inevitable in any complex environment, but their presence does not determine the final outcome. The decisive factor is the response that follows. When attention remains fixed on obstacles, progress slows and opportunities remain hidden. When attention shifts toward practical responses, experimentation, and continuous adjustment, even significant difficulties can become sources of development and learning. Another element that influences whether individuals focus on solutions or remain absorbed in problems is the role of cognitive habits formed through repetition. Human thinking patterns are not random. They develop gradually as the brain strengthens neural pathways that are used frequently. When a person repeatedly reacts to difficulties by complaining, worrying, or analyzing failures without taking action, the brain becomes increasingly efficient at reproducing those reactions. Over time, this pattern becomes automatic. The individual may believe that they are objectively evaluating situations, while in reality they are following a well-established mental routine. This mechanism explains why some individuals appear to encounter obstacles everywhere they look. The environment may contain both opportunities and challenges, but their attention consistently identifies the challenges first. The brain has been trained to detect and emphasize them. In contrast, individuals who habitually search for constructive responses develop a different mental routine. When they encounter a difficulty, their first reaction is not extended frustration, but the question of how the situation might be adjusted. The difference between these two responses is largely the result of practiced cognitive habits rather than innate personality traits. Developing a solution-oriented habit requires deliberate interruption of unproductive thought cycles. When a problem appears, the mind often begins constructing explanations, predicting negative outcomes, or recalling similar past failures. These mental activities may feel productive because they involve intense thinking, but they frequently lead to repetition rather than progress. Interrupting this cycle involves consciously redirecting attention toward the next practical step that could influence the situation. Even a small step can shift the mental process from passive analysis to active engagement. The significance of action should not be underestimated in the context of problem resolution. Action generates information that theoretical reasoning alone cannot provide. When an individual takes a step toward addressing a problem, the environment responds in some measurable way. This response reveals new details about the structure of the situation. Without such feedback, the individual is left relying solely on speculation. Therefore, solution-focused thinking emphasizes experimentation because experimentation converts uncertainty into data. Another reason experimentation is effective lies in the limits of prediction. Many real-world systems contain numerous interacting variables, making precise prediction difficult. Attempting to forecast every possible outcome before acting can therefore become an endless process. By contrast, small-scale experiments allow individuals to observe actual results rather than hypothetical scenarios. If the outcome is favorable, the strategy can be expanded. If the outcome is unfavorable, the strategy can be modified with minimal loss of time or resources. The ability to design useful experiments is itself a valuable skill. A well-designed experiment isolates a specific variable and observes how changes to that variable influence the overall system. For instance, if a team wishes to improve productivity, they might test whether adjusting meeting schedules affects the amount of uninterrupted work time available to employees. By changing only one variable at a time, the team can determine whether that variable contributes significantly to the problem. This systematic approach prevents confusion that might occur if multiple changes were introduced simultaneously. Another factor that encourages solution-focused thinking is the recognition that many problems are temporary conditions rather than permanent barriers. Situations evolve continuously due to technological development, social change, and shifts in available resources. What appears impossible at one moment may become feasible as new tools or information emerge. Maintaining awareness of this dynamic nature of systems prevents individuals from assuming that current limitations will remain indefinitely. Historical examples demonstrate this principle repeatedly. Many technological and scientific achievements were once considered unrealistic because the necessary methods had not yet been developed. Progress occurred when individuals continued exploring alternatives despite prevailing assumptions about what was possible. While not every problem will lead to a revolutionary breakthrough, the general lesson remains valuable. The current form of a problem does not necessarily represent its final form. The perception of time also plays an important role in how people approach difficulties. When a problem appears urgent, individuals may react impulsively in an attempt to remove the discomfort quickly. In such cases, attention may shift toward short-term relief rather than long-term effectiveness. A more analytical approach considers both the immediate and future consequences of different solutions. Some responses may resolve the visible symptom while leaving the underlying cause unchanged. Others may require more effort initially, but produce stable improvement over time. This distinction between short-term and long-term thinking is particularly relevant in organizational decision-making. Policies designed to produce rapid results may sometimes undermine sustainability if they neglect deeper structural issues. Conversely, strategies that address underlying causes may require patience before benefits become visible. Effective leaders therefore balance the need for immediate stability with the pursuit of long-term efficiency. Another useful concept in solution-focused thinking is the idea of opportunity cost. Every decision involves selecting one option among several alternatives. When attention remains fixed on a problem without exploring potential responses, valuable opportunities may be lost simply because they were never considered. By actively generating multiple strategies, individuals increase the likelihood that at least one approach will produce favorable results. Opportunity cost also encourages careful evaluation of where time and energy are invested. Spending hours discussing a difficulty without proposing a single constructive action may create the illusion of progress while producing little tangible improvement. Allocating the same time to brainstorming and testing solutions is more likely to produce meaningful change. This does not mean that discussion should be avoided. Rather, discussion should be structured so that it leads naturally toward action. Communication style also influences whether discussions remain problem-centered or solution-centered. Conversations dominated by negative language often reinforce feelings of frustration among participants. Statements that emphasize possibilities, alternatives, and practical adjustments create a different psychological environment. Participants begin thinking about how they can contribute to improvement rather than merely describing what is wrong. This shift in communication can significantly influence group dynamics. When team members feel that their ideas will be evaluated constructively, they are more willing to propose creative suggestions. Some of these suggestions may not succeed, but they expand the range of possibilities under consideration. Over time, the accumulation of small improvements generated through collaborative discussion can produce substantial progress. It is also important to recognize that not every problem requires an elaborate solution. In many situations, the most effective response involves simplifying procedures, removing unnecessary steps, or clarifying expectations. Complex systems often accumulate inefficiencies gradually, and these inefficiencies may remain unnoticed until a problem reveals them. Addressing the root of the difficulty may therefore involve reducing complexity rather than adding new layers of intervention. This principle aligns with a broader understanding of efficiency. Systems function best when their processes are clear, direct, and adaptable. When unnecessary complexity is introduced, the probability of errors increases, and the effort required to manage the system grows. Solution-focused thinking, therefore, involves not only creating new strategies, but also identifying elements that can be simplified or eliminated. Over time, individuals who consistently emphasize solutions begin to experience challenges differently from those who remain focused on problems. Instead of viewing obstacles as disruptions that threaten progress, they interpret them as signals that certain aspects of a system require adjustment. This interpretation encourages investigation rather than frustration. The mind becomes oriented toward learning rather than resistance. This orientation has practical advantages beyond problem resolution. Individuals who develop strong solution-focused habits tend to make decisions more efficiently because they spend less time in unproductive reflection. They also adapt more readily to changing circumstances because they are accustomed to revising strategies when conditions shift. In dynamic environments where uncertainty is unavoidable, these qualities provide a significant advantage. Ultimately, the ability to focus on solutions represents a disciplined approach to thinking rather than a temporary motivational technique. It requires careful observation, structured reasoning, and willingness to experiment. Problems will always arise in complex systems, but they need not dominate attention or determine outcomes. When individuals train their minds to move steadily from recognition of a difficulty toward constructive response, they transform challenges into opportunities for refinement and improvement. A further consideration in solution. Focused thinking involves the relationship between perception and interpretation. Two individuals may encounter the same difficulty, yet interpret it in completely different ways. One may see it as evidence that progress is impossible, while the other may view it as an indication that a particular method is ineffective and requires modification. The external situation remains identical, but the interpretation determines the response. Because human behavior is guided more by interpretation than by raw facts, the way a problem is perceived strongly influences whether a solution will be pursued. Interpretation is shaped by previous experiences, expectations, and learned beliefs. If an individual has repeatedly encountered situations in which problems were treated as failures or sources of criticism, they may develop an aversion to confronting difficulties directly. In such cases, the mind attempts to avoid the discomfort associated with the problem rather than addressing it. This avoidance may take several forms, including procrastination, denial, or the shifting of responsibility. While these responses may reduce immediate psychological stress, they rarely improve the situation itself. By contrast, individuals who have learned to treat problems as analytical challenges tend to approach them with curiosity rather than avoidance. Curiosity changes the emotional tone of the situation. Instead of asking whether the problem reflects personal inadequacy, the individual asks what underlying mechanism produced the outcome. This analytical approach reduces defensiveness and allows the mind to focus on identifying relationships between causes and effects. Over time, this habit strengthens the ability to respond rationally under pressure. Another aspect of effective problem resolution involves the careful distinction between symptoms and underlying causes. Many visible problems are only surface indicators of deeper structural issues. Attempting to eliminate the symptom without addressing the underlying cause often results in temporary relief, followed by recurrence of the difficulty. For example, an organization experiencing frequent errors in its workflow might initially attribute the issue to employee carelessness. However, a closer examination may reveal that the true cause lies in unclear procedures, insufficient training, or poorly designed systems. Addressing the symptom in this case, perhaps through disciplinary measures, would not eliminate the underlying weakness. Errors would likely continue because the structural problem remains unchanged. A solution-focused approach, therefore, requires identifying the level at which the difficulty originates. Once the root cause is understood, corrective actions can be designed to prevent the problem from reappearing. The process of identifying root causes often involves examining patterns across multiple occurrences of the same issue. A single instance may not provide enough information to determine the underlying mechanism. However, repeated observation of similar outcomes can reveal consistent factors that contribute to the problem. By comparing these instances carefully, individuals can distinguish between coincidental details and meaningful causal relationships. Another element of solution-oriented thinking involves recognizing the role of constraints. Every system operates within certain limitations, whether they involve resources, time, knowledge, or environmental conditions. Attempting to design solutions that ignore these constraints often leads to unrealistic plans. Effective problem-solving therefore integrates creativity with a realistic assessment of available capabilities. Constraints should not necessarily be viewed as negative factors. In many cases, they encourage innovation by forcing individuals to search for unconventional approaches. When resources are abundant, inefficient methods may continue simply because they are convenient. When resources are limited, greater attention is devoted to optimizing processes and eliminating waste. Many technological advancements have emerged from environments where constraints demanded creative solutions. Another dimension worth considering is the role of feedback timing. In some systems, the effects of a decision become visible almost immediately. In others, the consequences may appear only after a significant delay. Delayed feedback can make problem-solving more difficult because the connection between cause and effect becomes less obvious. Individuals may implement a solution and assume it was ineffective simply because the results have not yet had time to appear. Recognizing the possibility of delayed outcomes encourages patience and careful monitoring. Instead of abandoning a strategy prematurely, individuals evaluate whether sufficient time has passed to observe meaningful results. This practice prevents unnecessary changes that could destabilize an otherwise effective approach. A related concept is the importance of maintaining a learning orientation. Each attempt to address a problem provides information about how the system behaves. Even when a solution fails to produce the desired outcome, the experience contributes to a deeper understanding of the situation. Individuals who adopt a learning orientation treat these experiences as valuable data rather than as discouraging setbacks. This mindset is particularly evident in scientific and technological fields, where failure is often considered an integral part of discovery. Researchers rarely expect the first attempt at solving a complex problem to succeed completely. Instead, they anticipate a sequence of adjustments in which each attempt refines the previous one. By systematically analyzing the results of each step, they gradually approach an effective solution. In everyday contexts, adopting a similar attitude toward problem-solving can significantly improve resilience. When difficulties are interpreted as opportunities for learning, rather than as final judgments on ability, individuals remain more willing to continue exploring alternatives. Persistence becomes easier because each attempt contributes to progress in understanding the situation. Another factor that strengthens solution-focused thinking is the development of strategic foresight. Rather than addressing each problem only after it appears, individuals begin examining systems in advance to identify potential vulnerabilities. By anticipating where difficulties are likely to occur, preventive measures can be implemented before the problem becomes severe. This proactive approach reduces the frequency of crises and allows more time for thoughtful planning. Strategic foresight involves observing trends, evaluating risks, and considering how different factors might interact over time. While it cannot eliminate uncertainty entirely, it improves preparedness by identifying scenarios that deserve attention. When problems are anticipated early, the range of available solutions is often broader and less costly than when action is delayed. Communication also plays a central role in effective problem resolution. Many complex systems involve multiple participants whose actions influence one another. If information is not shared clearly, misunderstandings can create problems that would otherwise be avoidable. Transparent communication ensures that all participants understand the objectives, constraints, and responsibilities associated with a given task. When communication channels function effectively, problems are identified more quickly and addressed more efficiently. Participants can exchange observations, propose solutions, and coordinate actions without unnecessary delay. Conversely, when communication is unclear or restricted, small issues may develop into larger difficulties simply because the relevant information was not available to those capable of addressing them. It is also valuable to recognize that the process of solving one problem often reveals additional opportunities for improvement. Systems are interconnected, and changes introduced in one area may influence others. While this interconnectedness can sometimes create new challenges, it also allows improvements to spread throughout the system. A solution implemented to address a specific difficulty may ultimately strengthen the overall structure. This cumulative effect explains why organizations and individuals that consistently apply solution-focused thinking often experience continuous improvement. Each resolved issue contributes to a more refined understanding of how the system operates. Over time, the accumulation of small adjustments produces significant progress. The practice of focusing on solutions, therefore, extends beyond the immediate act of fixing problems. It represents a broader intellectual discipline that integrates observation, reasoning, experimentation, and reflection. By approaching challenges systematically and maintaining attention on constructive responses, individuals transform the role of problems within their experience. Instead of serving as barriers to progress, problems become catalysts for analysis, learning, and advancement. An additional perspective on solution-focused thinking emerges when examining how individuals allocate mental energy during periods of difficulty. Every problem introduces a demand on cognitive resources. The brain must interpret the situation, evaluate possible causes, and determine how to respond. However, the amount of mental energy available at any given time is limited. When a large portion of that energy is spent revisiting the negative aspects of a situation, less remains for constructive reasoning. This imbalance often results in prolonged frustration without meaningful progress. The efficient use of cognitive resources, therefore, becomes an important factor in problem resolution. Instead of repeatedly analyzing what has already occurred, solution-focused thinking directs attention toward the variables that can still be influenced. By concentrating on what remains changeable rather than on what cannot be altered, individuals ensure that their mental effort contributes to future improvement rather than past evaluation. This shift may appear subtle, yet it significantly alters the trajectory of thought. Another element that encourages constructive thinking is the separation of observation from interpretation. When individuals encounter a difficulty, they frequently attach immediate interpretations to the event. A delayed response from a colleague may be interpreted as disinterest. A technical failure may be interpreted as incompetence. And an unexpected obstacle may be interpreted as evidence that the entire project is flawed. These interpretations often arise automatically and can influence subsequent decisions. However, they are not always accurate reflections of reality. Solution-focused reasoning begins with careful observation before assigning meaning. Observations consist of verifiable facts, such as what occurred, when it occurred, and under what conditions. Interpretations are the explanations that individuals construct to account for those facts. By separating these two elements, individuals reduce the risk of basing decisions on assumptions rather than evidence. Once observations are clearly identified, possible interpretations can be examined critically and tested through further investigation. This analytical distinction is particularly valuable in environments where complex interactions occur. In many systems, a single event may have multiple plausible explanations. Selecting the first explanation that appears reasonable can lead to ineffective solutions if the interpretation proves incorrect. Maintaining a degree of intellectual caution encourages individuals to gather additional information before committing to a particular course of action. Another factor influencing the success of solution-focused thinking is the ability to recognize patterns over time. Problems rarely occur in complete isolation. Often, they represent recurring interactions between certain variables within a system. Identifying these patterns allows individuals to move beyond addressing individual incidents and instead modify the underlying structure that produces them. For instance, if a particular stage of a process consistently produces delays, it may indicate that the design of that stage requires modification. Addressing each delay individually would consume time without eliminating the root cause. Recognizing the pattern, however, allows attention to shift toward redesigning the procedure so that delays become less likely in the future. Pattern recognition, therefore, transforms reactive problem-solving into proactive system improvement. Another aspect worth considering is the relationship between complexity and clarity. Many individuals assume that solving a difficult problem requires an equally complicated solution. In practice, however, the most effective solutions often involve simplifying processes rather than complicating them. Complexity tends to increase the number of points at which errors can occur. Simplification reduces these points and makes systems easier to monitor and adjust. The pursuit of clarity is therefore an essential component of solution-focused thinking. Clear procedures, clear communication, and clear objectives reduce the likelihood of misunderstandings that might generate additional problems. When each participant in a system understands the expectations associated with their role, coordination improves and errors become easier to detect and correct. A related principle involves prioritization. Not every problem requires immediate attention, and attempting to address all difficulties simultaneously can dilute the effectiveness of problem-solving efforts. Solution-focused thinking involves evaluating which issues have the greatest impact on overall performance. By prioritizing these issues, individuals ensure that their efforts produce the most significant improvements. Prioritization also helps prevent decision fatigue. When individuals attempt to evaluate too many issues at once, the quality of their decisions may decline. Concentrating on a limited number of important variables allows deeper analysis and more thoughtful solutions. Once progress has been achieved in one area, attention can gradually expand to address additional concerns. Another critical factor is the management of emotional responses during problem-solving situations. Emotional reactions are natural when unexpected difficulties arise, yet they can interfere with rational analysis if allowed to dominate the decision-making process. Strong emotions may encourage impulsive responses that address immediate discomfort rather than the structural cause of the problem. Developing emotional awareness helps individuals maintain analytical clarity. Recognizing the presence of frustration or anxiety allows a brief pause before acting. During this pause, attention can return to the factual elements of the situation and the practical steps required for improvement. This process does not eliminate emotion, but prevents it from determining the entire response. In many professional environments, the ability to maintain composure under pressure is considered a key indicator of effective leadership. Leaders who remain focused on constructive responses during crises help stabilize the behavior of others within the system. Their example encourages colleagues to shift from panic toward coordinated problem resolution. Another useful technique involves visualizing the desired outcome before attempting to design a solution. When individuals imagine the conditions that would represent success, they clarify the objective they are attempting to achieve. This clarity guides the selection of strategies and prevents efforts from becoming scattered across unrelated tasks. Once the desired outcome is defined, the next step is identifying the sequence of actions that could realistically lead toward it. This approach is frequently used in project planning. Teams begin by defining the final objective and then work backward to determine the steps necessary to reach that objective. Each step represents a smaller, manageable task that contributes to the overall solution. By organizing the process in this way, complex challenges become structured pathways rather than undefined difficulties. Another element that strengthens solution-focused thinking is reflection after a problem has been resolved. Many individuals move quickly from one task to another once a difficulty disappears. While this approach saves time in the short term, it may prevent valuable learning. Reflecting briefly on what caused the problem and how the solution succeeded allows individuals to refine their understanding and prepare for similar situations in the future. This reflective practice contributes to continuous improvement. Each resolved issue becomes a source of knowledge that can guide future decisions. Over time, the accumulation of such insights produces a more sophisticated approach to problem management. Individuals become better equipped to recognize early warning signs, anticipate potential obstacles, and design effective responses. It is also important to acknowledge that certain problems will remain unresolved despite considerable effort. In complex environments, some variables may remain beyond the influence of those attempting to change them. In such cases, the most rational response may involve adaptation rather than elimination of the difficulty. Adjusting expectations, modifying goals, or redirecting resources toward more productive opportunities can sometimes represent the most practical solution available. Recognizing when to adapt rather than persist indefinitely is an important aspect of strategic thinking. Persistence is valuable when progress remains possible, but inflexible persistence can waste resources if the fundamental conditions cannot be changed. Evaluating whether a situation still offers realistic potential for improvement allows individuals to allocate their efforts more effectively. Through these practices, solution-focused thinking becomes an integrated approach to managing complexity. Attention is directed toward actionable variables. Interpretations are examined carefully. Patterns are identified, and strategies are refined through observation and feedback. This disciplined allocation of cognitive effort ensures that problems are addressed with clarity rather than frustration. As a result, the presence of difficulties no longer disrupts progress, but instead becomes an opportunity to refine systems, improve understanding, and advance toward more effective outcomes. In numerous situations, individuals clearly understand what they want to achieve, but rely on strategies that are no longer effective. When the method fails to produce the expected result, attention often remains focused on the obstacle rather than on evaluating whether the strategy itself should be reconsidered. A solution-focused mindset treats methods as flexible tools rather than fixed commitments. If a particular approach fails repeatedly, the logical response is to reassess the method rather than to persist indefinitely with the same process. This principle is common in scientific investigation. Researchers rarely assume that their initial hypothesis is correct simply because it was carefully designed. Instead, they treat each hypothesis as a provisional explanation that must withstand experimental testing. If the results contradict the hypothesis, it is revised or replaced with a more accurate model. The emphasis remains on discovering what works rather than defending previous assumptions. This intellectual flexibility allows scientific knowledge to evolve gradually toward more reliable explanations. The same reasoning can be applied to everyday problem solving. When a plan encounters consistent resistance from reality, the situation may indicate that the method requires modification. Continuing to apply the same strategy while expecting a different outcome often leads to frustration. By contrast, examining alternative approaches increases the likelihood of finding a more effective path toward the desired objective. Another element that influences problem resolution is the clarity with which objectives are defined. When individuals attempt to solve a problem without clearly identifying the outcome they want to achieve, their efforts may become scattered. Different solutions may appear attractive because they address certain aspects of the issue, yet they may not align with the central objective. Clear goals provide a reference point against which each potential solution can be evaluated. For example, an organization attempting to improve customer satisfaction must first determine what specific indicators represent satisfaction. These indicators might include response time, product reliability, communication quality, or overall user experience. Once these factors are defined, solutions can be evaluated according to how effectively they influence those indicators. Without such clarity, initiatives may focus on activities that appear beneficial but have little impact on the actual objective. The relationship between goals and solutions also highlights the importance of measuring outcomes rather than intentions. A strategy may be designed with excellent intentions, yet its effectiveness must ultimately be evaluated by the results it produces. Solution-focused thinking therefore emphasizes observable changes rather than assumptions about what should work. When results are measured accurately, ineffective strategies can be identified and replaced more quickly. Another factor that encourages constructive problem solving is the ability to maintain a balanced perspective regarding risk. Every solution involves some degree of uncertainty. Taking action always introduces the possibility that the outcome may differ from expectations. Individuals who focus heavily on the potential risks of action may hesitate to implement any solution at all. Conversely, those who ignore risk entirely may pursue strategies that create additional problems. A balanced approach recognizes that risk cannot be eliminated, but can be managed. Before implementing a solution, individuals evaluate the potential consequences and determine whether those consequences are acceptable in relation to the potential benefits. If the risk appears manageable, the strategy can be tested on a limited scale before wider implementation. This measured experimentation reduces the likelihood of severe negative outcomes while still allowing progress to occur. Another important consideration is the role of resource allocation. Every organization and individual possesses limited resources, including time, energy, finances, and attention. Effective problem solving requires careful decisions about how these resources are distributed. When resources are scattered across too many initiatives simultaneously, none may receive sufficient attention to succeed. Concentrating resources on a small number of well-defined solutions often produces better results. Resource allocation also influences the speed of progress. Projects that receive consistent support are more likely to move forward efficiently. When attention shifts repeatedly between competing priorities, momentum is lost and solutions remain incomplete. Maintaining focus on a chosen strategy long enough to evaluate its effectiveness allows meaningful results to emerge. Another dimension of solution-focused thinking involves recognizing the difference between reversible and irreversible decisions. Some choices can be adjusted easily if the outcome proves unsatisfactory, while others involve long-term commitments that are difficult to reverse. Understanding this distinction helps determine how much analysis is required before acting. Reversible decisions can often be tested quickly through experimentation, whereas irreversible decisions may require more careful evaluation. By categorizing decisions in this way, individuals can avoid unnecessary delays. Many situations that appear to require extensive analysis actually involve reversible choices that could be tested with minimal risk. Recognizing this fact encourages faster experimentation and accelerates learning about which solutions are effective. The ability to revise strategies also depends on maintaining accurate records of actions and outcomes. Documentation allows individuals to review the sequence of events that led to a particular result. Without such records, valuable information may be forgotten, making it difficult to understand why certain solutions succeeded or failed. Keeping systematic records transforms problem-solving into a cumulative learning process rather than a series of isolated events. Another useful practice is comparing similar problems across different contexts. A solution that proves effective in one environment may offer insights for addressing difficulties in another. While conditions are rarely identical, examining how other systems resolved comparable challenges can reveal strategies that might otherwise remain unnoticed. This comparative approach expands the range of possible solutions and encourages creative adaptation. It is also beneficial to recognize that solutions rarely emerge from a single moment of insight. More often, they develop through gradual refinement. Initial ideas are tested, evaluated, and adjusted repeatedly until they reach a practical form. Expecting a perfect solution to appear instantly can create unrealistic expectations that discourage persistence. Accepting that effective strategies evolve through continuous improvement encourages patience and sustained effort. Over time, individuals who practice this approach begin to view challenges as opportunities to improve systems rather than as interruptions to normal activity. Each difficulty reveals aspects of the system that can be optimized. When these insights are applied consistently, the system becomes more efficient and resilient. This perspective ultimately reinforces a fundamental principle of rational problem management. Problems themselves are neutral events within complex systems. Their significance arises from how they are interpreted and addressed. When attention remains fixed on the limitations they represent, progress slows. When attention shifts toward designing, testing, and refining responses, those same problems become sources of information that guide improvement. Through disciplined observation, careful reasoning, and continuous experimentation, individuals can transform the presence of obstacles into a process of structured development. In this way, focusing on solutions does not eliminate problems from life, but ensures that each problem contributes to greater understanding and more effective action in the future. In practical terms, focusing on solutions rather than problems represents a disciplined way of thinking about challenges. Problems are inevitable in any complex system, whether in personal life, professional environments, or large organizations. However, the outcome of a problem is determined less by its initial difficulty and more by the response that follows. When attention remains fixed on the obstacle, its causes, frustrations, or perceived unfairness, progress tends to slow because cognitive energy is directed toward what cannot be changed. When attention shifts toward identifying controllable variables, testing alternatives, and evaluating outcomes, the same situation becomes manageable. Solution. Focused thinking, therefore, involves a deliberate balance between understanding and action. Problems must be defined clearly, their causes examined carefully, and constraints acknowledged realistically. Yet once sufficient understanding has been reached, attention must move toward designing responses and learning from the results they produce. Through repeated application of this process, observation, experimentation, feedback, and adjustment. Individuals and organizations gradually transform difficulties into opportunities for improvement. In this way, the presence of problems no longer represents a barrier to progress, but becomes a mechanism through which systems evolve toward greater effectiveness.